Welcome to the land of the pyramids, the land of pharaohs, the land of the temples, and the land of the mummies. For over 3,000 years, the ancient Egyptians ruled the Nile Valley, producing some of the most memorable art, architecture, and artifacts the world has ever seen. In this episode, journey back to the land of Khufu, Hatshepsut, and Ramses to learn about what made ancient Egyptian society endure longer than the ancient Greeks, the Romans, and even modern American society. Come with me as we unlock the mysteries of ancient Egypt. Before we get to the specifics of ancient Egyptian culture, it's important to put the rise of ancient Egypt, and indeed its entire lifespan, into a broader historical and geographical context. Prior to the rise of Egyptian culture in the Nile Valley, and the contemporaneous Near Eastern civilizations in Mesopotamia, people around the world lived in fairly similar ways. Biological anthropologists trace human origins back to around 200,000 years ago. And for 95% of human history, up until about 10,000 years ago, people wandered the globe hunting and gathering in an attempt to feed themselves. Strange thought as I sit here eating pizza, delivered straight to my doorstep. Delicious. As the last ice age ended and the weather warmed up, populations around the globe grew rapidly, and soon it became difficult to chase large game. Now, when you started chasing woolly mammoths for several miles, you'd run into another group of people who naturally thought those woolly mammoths had become their own. As a result of this increasing population density, people found that it was sometimes easier to put a little work into the land, watering some plants, fencing in some goats, rather than chasing giant woolly mammoths all over the place. Over the generations, this care for the land led to permanent farming communities and animal domestication, a moment we call the Neolithic Revolution. While farming might not seem like a very big deal, after all, who wouldn't prefer a giant steak to a bowl of salad? Permanent settlements and a surplus of crops had dramatic long-term effects. The increased food and stability led to even further population growth. Moreover, it allowed people to specialize in terms of their jobs. All of a sudden, not everyone had to be involved in food production all day, every day. Now sure, most people were still focused on food, but a few people could work as priests, or politicians, or artisans, or computer programmers. Over time, this job specialization led to technological advances like the wheel, or metallurgy, or ceramics, or writing. And these technological advances led to a very different type of society, one where everything was all of a sudden different. There were different types of buildings, temples and palaces and houses and communal spaces. There were different types of people, the aforementioned priests and politicians and farmers and artisans and computer programmers. There were different levels of economic well-being, from the wealthy aristocracy to the middle-class artisans to the poor farmers and still poorer slaves. In short, the world had shifted from a place where everyone was pretty similar socioeconomically, doing the same type of food production jobs, to a place marked by differentiation, where different types of people did different jobs that led to different outcomes. Led by a shift from stone to metal technology, this marked the shift to what is now known as the Neolithic, or from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age. And that's where we pick up our story of ancient Egypt. Compared to any other ancient empire, ancient Egypt was geographically constrained. It was centered on the Nile River Valley and extended no more than a couple kilometers east and west of the actual Nile River. Its natural settings afforded it a level of protection and insularity that few other civilizations could match. On the north, it was bordered by the Mediterranean Sea. On the east, the Sinai Desert prevented invasions from the Levant and Near East. The west, too, yielded desert, as did the south. And although the Nile River is easily navigable towards north of the Aswan Dam, the current Aswan Dam, the site of ancient Aswan, a series of cataracts, or shallow waters with rocks and rapids, impeded navigation between the Sudan and Egypt proper. As the Greek historian Herodotus mentioned, Egypt was, quote-unquote, the gift of the Nile. Rarely were the ancient historians so accurate in their assessment. The flooding of the Nile River, up until the construction of the Aswan Dam in the 1960s occurred fairly predictably every year, provided the water and nutrients necessary for agriculture in the Nile River Valley. There were 3 distinct seasons: the flooding season, the growing season, and the harvest season. And because of the distinctness of each, workers had a substantial amount of time each year during the floods when working the fields was impossible. This surplus of labor allowed for the construction of most Egyptian buildings, the most famous of Egyptian buildings. Everything from the pyramids of the Old Kingdom to the grand temples of the New Kingdom. It's safe to say that without the annual flooding of the Nile River, ancient Egypt wouldn't play the role that it does in modern-day world history textbooks and in classes like this one about the ancient world. The way that we conceptualize ancient Egyptian history in today's world is largely the result of an Egyptian priest living in Ptolemaic or Greek Egypt around 300 BC. This priest, named Manetho, wrote a history of pharaonic Egypt known as the Egyptiaca, likely at the request of Ptolemy I Soter, the first Greek king of Egypt. In this work, Manetho divides the previous 3,000 years into dynasties based on whether there was a continuous transfer of power from father to son of the Egyptian pharaohs. Manetho himself identified 30 dynasties, and if you include the Greek Ptolemies, as most scholars do, that brings us to a total of 31 ancient Egyptian dynasties. In general, long-lived dynasties with many rulers from the same lineage represented times of peace and prosperity, while short-lived dynasties of few rulers indicated times of upheaval and unrest. Modern Egyptology have then grouped these dynasties based on characteristics into broader categories known as kingdoms and intermediate periods. Kingdoms are a series of dynasties linked by stability, central authority, freedom from evasion, monumental building, and overall prosperity. There are 3 of these, known as the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms. Intermediate periods, on the other hand, are essentially the opposite of kingdoms. They're times of weak government, invasions, instability, and unrest. There are also 3 intermediate periods known as the first, second, and third. In the rest of this lecture, we'll do a brief chronological run through the kingdoms and intermediate periods of ancient Egyptian history. The goal here is not necessarily to cover every single detail, but rather to give you a broad overview of the major achievements and developments that occurred throughout ancient Egypt's 3,000-year history. To understand the earliest dynasties of Egypt, you have to get a sense for how ancient Egyptian civilization coalesced into a single entity. Prior to 3000 BC, Egypt was largely split into 2 distinct centers, known as Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. And this is a little confusing here, because the Nile River runs from south to north. So Upper Egypt is upriver, and it's actually in the southern part of the country. In the pre-dynastic period, important Upper Egyptian sites included Hierakonpolis, also known as Nechin, Thinis, and Nakada. Later in the dynastic period, Upper Egypt centered around the site of Thebes, with religious centers at places like Luxor and Karnak. We can tell from archaeological artifacts that the rulers of Upper Egypt, prior to the unification of the culture, wore the white crown, a white bowling pin-shaped headdress, and were identified with the hawk god Horus and the vulture god Nekhbet. Basically, when you think of Upper Egypt, think of an important center in southern Egypt located along the Nile River. Lower Egypt, on the other hand, is located in the northern part of the country, closer to where the Nile empties into the Mediterranean Sea. Its main administrative center was at Memphis, located at the junction of the Nile River Valley and the Nile Delta, a triangular-shaped marshy region. It actually gets its name from the Greek letter delta, which is shaped like a triangle, formed from small branches of the Nile shooting off as it approaches its outlet. The rulers of Lower Egypt wore the red crown, marked by its distinctive curlicue, and it is in this region that the earliest pyramids would eventually be built. Egypt, before the unification between Upper and Lower, is a mysterious time. We have evidence for rulers in both regions, but it's tough to establish exact dates or spheres of power or influence. One of the best examples of this is the now famous Scorpion King, Evidence for the Scorpion King comes from several sources: ivory tags, vessel and rock inscriptions, but most of all, a finely carved ceremonial mace head. And a mace, of course, is what you normally use for beating people over the head and smiting your enemies, but this was a ceremonial one. The mace head shows a ruler, distinguished by his size and his headdress, the white crown of Upper Egypt, holding a hoe for irrigation. Beside his head is the depiction of a scorpion, from which he gets his name. Because he seems to be clearly signaled as a ruler, and because he wears only the crown of Upper Egypt, scholars tend to think that this may be one of the last rulers of a divided Egypt. If you're interested in learning more about the Scorpion King, check out the movie starring The Rock for a completely inaccurate depiction of pre-dynastic Egypt. While the details of the unification process are hotly debated by Egyptologists, evidence for the completed process comes from one of the most important artifacts in all of ancient Egypt, the Narmer Palette. A palette is a kind of thing you use for mashing up minerals to create makeup. And in this case, it's a ceremonial palette, just like we had the ceremonial mace head, depicting the king Narmer, one of, if not the first, king of a united Egypt. On the front of the palette, we can see the king of Upper Egypt, once again identifiable by his centricity, size, and the white crown, smiting an unfortunate prisoner with a mace. The prisoner, it would seem, is from Lower Egypt, as identified by the personified reeds mounted by a hawk above the prisoner's head. This would seem to indicate that the unification process occurred when a king of Upper Egypt was able to forcefully conquer Lower Egypt. On the back of the palette, the area for mineral grinding is formed by the entwined necks of two mythical beasts, the entanglement signaling the new connectedness of Upper and Lower Egypt. Above this, the king now wears the curlicue crown of Lower Egypt, with standard bearers marching in front and a series of decapitated captives to the side. Debate rages as to whether the palette depicts an actual series of events, or if it is something commemorative to signal the power of a particular ruler over a united Egypt. Nevertheless, the Narmer Palette suggests that by around 3000 BC, the distinctive centers of Upper and Lower Egypt had become united. The dynastic era had begun. Dynasties 1 and 2, known as the early dynastic period, mark a time when the rulers of a united Egypt were still trying to figure things out. While they didn't yet build pyramids, they did build what are known as mastaba tombs. These tombs represented the primordial mound from which all creation arose, and it was here that the pharaoh was buried. In the earliest days, the pharaoh was not the only one to go into the afterlife. His entire court, dozens if not hundreds of people, would be sacrificed upon the death of the king to serve him in the afterlife. Later in Egyptian history, these actual human sacrifices were replaced by miniature servants, miniature statues of servants, known as ushabtis, a slightly more efficient, not to mention less gruesome way of serving the pharaoh in the afterlife. Dynasties 3 through 6, from about 2700 BC to 2200 BC, make up the Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramids. The political center of the country was now in Lower Egypt, centered around the city of Memphis. Surrounding Memphis are some of the most famous necropolis, or cities of the dead, in the entire world. Saqqara became the site of the first pyramid and tomb for the pharaoh Djoser around 2650 BC. The pyramid at Saqqara is known as a stepped pyramid for obvious reasons, and once again it represents the primordial mound from which creation arose. As you can see, it's essentially one mastaba tomb on top of another, on top of another, on top of another. The architect of this monumental achievement was none other than the vizier, the highest ranking official serving the pharaoh. His name was Imhotep. So next time you see him terrorizing Brendan Fraser in The Mummy, remember that he was actually a pretty cool dude back in the 3rd dynasty. It was in the 4th dynasty that pyramids reached their figurative and literal peak. The necropolis moved to the site of Giza, and it was here that the pharaohs Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure built a series of 3 pyramids that serve as the most visited site in all of Egypt. It is the earliest of these 3 pyramids, Khufu's pyramid, that was the largest and later became the only surviving work of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Khufu's pyramid is nearly 500 feet high, covering 13 acres, and it was just one part of a much larger religious complex. Those larger complexes can best be seen with the pyramid and sphinx of the pharaoh Khafre, whose pyramid is recognizable by the white limestone casing near the top of it. In fact, all these pyramids would have once had a fine white limestone casing covering the rocky edges. The 3 satellite or queen's pyramids of the pharaoh Menkaure, whose pyramid is the smallest of the 3, make up the 3rd pyramid at Giza. As evidenced by the enormous amount of labor that they could command, the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom were characterized by their divinity. Unapproachable by any normal citizen, the pharaohs wielded complete power and authority throughout the land. This came to a halt, though, around the 6th dynasty, around 2180 BC, in large part because the pharaoh Pepi II reigned for so long. He became pharaoh at 6 years old, and then continued ruling until he was 100, a whopping 94 years in power. And he ruled so long that he outlived most of his useful successors. Egypt then descended into the first intermediate period where central administration lost control over some parts of its territory. Power reconsolidated in the 11th dynasty around 2050 BC, which marks the beginning of the Middle Kingdom. We lose the impressive pyramids of the Old Kingdom, but we gain a new understanding of the position of the pharaoh. Now, rather than a distant god, the pharaoh begins portraying himself as a shepherd of the people, depicted complete with shepherd's crook, somebody they can relate to who's taking care of them. It's also during this time that we get a geographical shift in the administrative center from Lower to Upper Egypt, located in the south. Religion shifts too, and Osiris becomes the god of choice. In that myth, the god Osiris battles his brother Set for control over Egypt. Set tricks Osiris and kills him, dismembering him and scattering his body parts all over the Egyptian land. But Osiris's faithful wife, Isis, also his sister, a little bit weird, collects these body parts, putting them back together via the process of mummification. She then has relations with him, and 9 months later, she bears him a son, Horus, the hawk god. Horus eventually is able to defeat his evil uncle Set, and afterwards Horus becomes god of the overworld, while Osiris becomes god of death in the underworld. And it is from this myth, in large part, that we get an explanation for the practice of mummification in Egypt. The Middle Kingdom came to an end around 1650 BC, due in large part to an invasion of a Semitic group called the Hyksos. They brought war chariots and bronze weapons and gained power in Egypt for nearly 100 years. Amazingly, we still have some of the royal mummies from the end of the Second Intermediate Period in the battles between the Egyptians and the Hyksos, the most dramatic of which is Seqenenre Tao II, who still shows evidence of receiving a battle axe to the head in the battle for control of Egypt. After defeating the Hyksos, Egypt entered the New Kingdom, starting around 1550 BC and encompassing dynasties 18 to 20. It was during the New Kingdom that Egypt shifted from a strong state to a legitimate empire, expanding beyond its traditional boundaries to include much of Nubia to the south, Libya to the west, and the Levant to the northeast. The New Kingdom also includes some of Egypt's most famous pharaohs. Hatshepsut, for example, was the first female pharaoh. And as if just being pharaoh wasn't enough, she went about enacting an expansive set of political, social, and military programs, leaving Egypt far more powerful than when she gained the throne. Artists, however, seem to feel ambiguous about how to depict her, and we have her portrayed both as female and as male rulers. Her temple complex at Deir el-Bahri still stands today as one of the most impressive structures of New Kingdom Egypt. The massive funerary complex of Hatshepsut, though, stands in contrast to the traditional focus of building during the New Kingdom. Rather than focus on massive funerary complexes, New Kingdom pharaohs focused their architectural efforts on temples, such as the Temple of Amun at Karnak and the multi-god temple at Luxor. The locomotive engine that was the New Kingdom came to a brief halt during the reign of Amenhotep IV, later known as Akhenaten. Although he started his reign like other New Kingdom pharaohs, he soon decided to move the capital into the middle of the desert, at Akhenaten, now known as Amarna. He also decided to get rid of the gods Amun, Osiris, Ra, the traditional pantheon, and instead focus strictly on the Aten, or sun disk. And for this reason, some call Akhenaten the first monotheistic ruler in history. His new style of portraiture also marked a distinct shift from what came before, as can be seen in these side-by-side statues of Amenhotep III, his predecessor, and Akhenaten. Perhaps even more famous is his wife, Nefertiti, whose famous bust still widely regarded as one of the most beautiful sculptures in all of antiquity. Things largely got back to normal after the death of Akhenaten, thanks to his son, a short-lived pharaoh by the name of Tutankhamun. Within this context, simply putting the name of the god Amun into the name of the pharaoh marked an important shift back towards normalcy, the normal pantheon of gods. While Tutankhamun did little in terms of territorial expansion, his afterlife has had more of an impact than perhaps any other pharaoh. Pharaohs during this period were burying themselves underground in the Valley of the Kings, perhaps chosen as a location because of the natural rock feature that looks kind of like a pyramid rising far above the valley floor. Seeing how the pyramids of the Old Kingdom were robbed long ago, they attempted a greater level of secrecy. But nevertheless, the vast majority of tombs were looted far back in antiquity. One, however, escaped the grips of tomb raiders, and it was not uncovered until 1922 by archaeologist Howard Carter and his patron, Lord Carnarvon. Carter's response to what lay inside was simply, "Wonderful things." And wonderful they were. Thrones and benches and beds and statues, and most of all, the coffin of the pharaoh himself. Actually, a series of coffins, one inside the other. Inside the innermost coffin lies the gold burial mask, perhaps the most iconic artifact in all of ancient Egypt. Egyptian power reached its territorial peak in the 19th dynasty under Ramses II, who fought battles hundreds of miles away in the Levant to increase Egyptian territory. Shortly after his death, the entire Mediterranean region came under calamity, the famous Bronze Age collapse, and Egypt was flung back into the Third Intermediate Period. And after that, they recovered briefly, but then would soon come under control of outside groups, the Assyrians, the Persians, and eventually the Greeks. And it was under the Greeks, known as the Ptolemaic dynasty because the first ruler was named Ptolemy, that Egypt had its single longest lasting dynasty, and Manetho wrote his Aegyptiaca. Later, Egypt would fall under Roman hands after the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra by the young Octavian. Later, the first emperor Augustus. And as the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century AD, so did ancient Egypt. When Egypt began to rise again, it was under Arab rule, and the culture that maintained its consistency for so long, perhaps longer than any other continuous civilization, was relegated to the dusty tombs and abandoned temples of the pharaohs of antiquity.